It's the evening of April 22nd, 2005, in the town of Westminster, Orange County. The Westminster Police Department has just received a call from a 28-year-old man, Young Nguyen, who is concerned about his ex-girlfriend, Anita Vo. Despite being broken up, he and Anita were still close. He had stopped by her house that night to drop off some food for her and her mom, Ha Smith. The mother and daughter lived in a one-story house on a tranquil street. When no one came to the door after he knocked, he went to see if they were in the backyard. He looked through the gate, but all he could see was their white Pomeranian Mitty out there by itself, not Anita or her mother. He then peered through one of the windows, and to his surprise, he saw that the house was in complete disarray. Clothes pulled out of drawers, items scattering the floor, couch cushions upturned. The house looked like it was ransacked, so he called the police. The police arrive and they force entry into the home, and they immediately walk into a brutal scene, one that many officers described as bizarre and unlike anything they had seen before. Hi strangers, this is your host Alexa Morrissey, and today I have a twisted story of revenge that will make you think twice about letting someone you think you know into your home. This is the murders of Anita Vo and Ha Smith. Lock your doors and listen closely. This is Stranger in the House. Police have just arrived at the home of 52-year-old Ha Smith and her 23-year-old daughter, Anita Vo, after her ex-boyfriend called concerned about her after he looked through a window and saw that their house was ransacked. Right when the police enter the house, they are confronted with a brutal scene. A body of a woman is laying on the floor in front of them. They can see that this woman is deceased, and there are pools of blood around her. But that's not the shocking part of the scene. The woman appears to be covered in a thick, bright white substance that they soon discover is paint. This woman also has a piece of cloth over her face. She's eventually identified as 23-year-old Anita Vo, Young's ex-girlfriend. Stab wounds on her body suggest she had been attacked with a knife. Her hands are riddled with defensive wounds, suggesting she fought whoever had done this to her. Only a few feet away, another body. Again, it's obvious that this woman has been stabbed and is also covered in white paint. This body, however, seems to have been positioned in what looks like a bowing pose, face down, knees bent, with her hands out in front of her. It's 52-year-old Ha Smith, Anita's mother. Blood smears and trails near the body suggested that they were dragged or the injured victims tried to crawl away. The medical examiner also determined that Ha was hit in the head with a glass bottle that was found at the scene. Both mother and daughter died from blood loss, and it was suggested that they had most likely been killed the day before. This scene is unlike anything the police in Westminster have ever experienced, and homicide detective Timothy Vu is brought on right away. Now, Detective Vu had been called to the scene because he was a homicide detective, but he was also a member of the Vietnamese community in Westminster, of which Anita and Ha were a part of. When Detective Vu arrives, it's clear to him that a knife was used to kill both victims, but he quickly suspects that more than one person did this. To Detective Vu, it would have been difficult for one person to be able to take on both victims and not risk one of them running out and calling for help. A knife was found near the bodies, and there seemed to be others missing from the kitchen knife block, again suggesting that there was more than one attacker, but also suggesting that the murderers had entered the home without weapons. In addition to the brutal slayings, the whole house was torn apart, suggesting the criminals were looking for something. Couch cushions were on the floor, drawers were pulled out of cabinets and dressers. It seemed like every part of this house had been searched. According to one forensic psychologist, Dr. Julie Armstrong, when a crime scene is left in such a disarray, it suggests anger or extreme rage. And both victims were stabbed as many as 10 times, which is an extremely up-close and personal act, and it also suggests rage. And then there's the positioning of Ha Smith's body. which seems deliberately disrespectful, as if they wanted to make her bow to her killers. Police find a plastic bag of bloody knives by the door that the killers seemingly left behind. The crime was unique, but it was the white paint that puzzled the police the most. It was clear to them that the white paint had been deliberately poured over both victims, but they just couldn't understand why. Was it to cover something up? Was it another form of disrespect to the bodies? Or was it more symbolic? When Detective Vu saw the crime scene in the white paint, he wondered if the killers were a part of the Vietnamese community as well. Because while many Western cultures use the color black to signify when someone has died, in Vietnamese culture, white is the color of mourning. Orange County has one of the largest concentrations of Vietnamese immigrants in the US, and the Little Saigon district in Westminster is the largest in the United States. Over 189,000 Vietnamese Americans reside there. With its variety of restaurants and unique shops, it's rich in Vietnamese culture. According to the Los Angeles Times, when Anita was a child, she and her mother Ha had fled from Vietnam and ended up in a refugee camp in Thailand. They then arrived in the United States in 1988. According to one of her sisters, Ha struggled for a long time to make ends meet as a single mother. But eventually she did, and she became very successful. Also known as Miss Ha, Ha Smith became famous in the Vietnamese community as a fortune teller that did palm and card readings. She was very well respected in the community, and she had clients from around the country as far away as New York. According to an article by the Daily Spectrum, people in this area went to fortune tellers for a lot of different reasons. It wouldn't be uncommon for somebody in this community to go to Ha for a consultation before they bought a house or made a big financial decision. Some clients would even go to fortune tellers just to get some hope for the future. And while Ha Smith did have an office, clients would often go to Smith's home and pay up to $15,000 in cash for her services. Ha Smith made good money as a fortune teller in Little Saigon, and her daughter Anita was also on track for success. Anita was a student at Orange Coast College. She was described as fun, fashionable, and ambitious. She modeled occasionally for designers in the community and talked about running her own business one day. One of her professors was quoted in the Los Angeles Times as saying, "Anita has an incredible sense of style and grace about her." Because of Ha Smith's well-known success, many in the area knew that she was wealthy and had a lot of expensive jewelry. This had led to 2 different home invasions and robberies in 2001. Each time, jewelry had been stolen. After those incidents, Smith started to increase security. She apparently had changed all the locks and placed iron bars over the window of her home. With these previous robberies, the police had to wonder, was this why Ha and Anita were murdered and their home was ransacked? Had it been a robbery gone wrong? But then, what about the white paint and the positioning of Ha's body? The crime scene also suggested that the victims knew their killers. There were no signs of forced entry, and the bars were still in the windows, and the locks had not been tampered with. Fresh flowers and a cup and a straw in the kitchen sink had suggested guests, which means that the killers had been let in by either Anita or Ha. This crime scene was so unique that Detective Vu looked to see if there had been any similar murders, specifically with white paint in different jurisdictions, but the database search came up empty. The police then looked to the people in Anita and Ha's life that could potentially be suspects. Now right away, they look at the boyfriend who called in the crime, Young. See, Young and Anita had a rocky relationship. Apparently there had been issues of jealousy from both sides. And at the time of the murder, they were separated because they had had a falling out. After interviewing Young, the police determined that there really wasn't any animosity between him and Anita, and they remained close friends despite their breakup. And more importantly, he had an alibi that checked out. According to his employer, Young was at work at the time of the murder. Police then looked to see if the robberies that had taken place 4 years prior might be connected. The 2 men who were persons of interest at the time of the robberies were looked at, but it turned out that both of them were already in police custody when the murders occurred. After these 2 theories end up being dead ends, the police get a tip that leads them to a new person of interest. After interviewing neighbors, the police find out that there had been a handyman working on Ha and Anita's home in the days leading up to the murders. This man was called into the police station for questioning, And when he arrives, the police notice that his shoes and his clothes are covered in white paint. During the interview, the handyman says that he often uses white paint in his work, and it's not unusual for his clothes to have paint on them. Now, despite his explanation and the fact that he had an alibi, the police still take his shoes for analyzing. The paint on the handyman's work boots was analyzed against the paint used on the victims, and it was determined that they were not the same paint. With no other leads, the police look to the forensic evidence at the crime scene. The police find DNA that did not belong to either victim on the knives and on the cup in the sink. Unfortunately, that DNA didn't match anyone in the police's criminal database. A footprint on a towel in the bathroom was also found, and on it were traces of blood. This suggests that the suspect or suspects tried to clean themselves off in the bathroom after the murders, and then some blood was left on the towel as they entered or exited the shower. The footprint also suggested that whoever had tried to clean themselves off was most likely a woman. A few days after the murder, a neighbor comes forward with some new information. She says that on the day of the murder, she saw a man and a woman visiting Ha Smith's home. The witness says they both appeared to be Asian, and the woman was maybe in her 40s, only slightly younger than the man. So the police bring in a sketch artist to make a rendering of these two people she saw, and they bring the sketches to the public. Family and friends of Ha and Anita offered a $10,000 reward for any tips about the murder. The ex-boyfriend, Young, who called the cops, put half of that money into the reward and gave a heartbreaking public statement pleading for information while holding Anita and Ha's Pomeranian. With no tips coming in, the police become discouraged. But 6 days later, activity on Ha and Anita's credit cards are reported to the police by the credit card companies. They track the credit card use to certain stores in Santa Ana and Anaheim, both cities within Orange County. Surveillance cameras from the stores show a middle-aged Asian woman using a card to buy clothes and other items, including a laptop. Her spending total was over $75,000 in a matter of days. The security image of this woman was compared to the police sketch, and there was a clear similarity. Now, this woman had used their credit cards and was using Ha Smith's ID, but other than the images on the surveillance, the police didn't have much to go on. Luckily, the police didn't have to wait too long for this mystery woman to start using the cards again. A couple weeks later, the woman starts using a card for another shopping spree, but this time it's taking place across the country, in Georgia. This doesn't help the police too much, but they continue to follow the credit card transactions, and they see a trip is booked for Memorial Day weekend to Orange County, the place of the murder. And who are these tickets booked for, you ask? Ha Smith and Anita Vo, plus 3 others. The police know that whoever booked the tickets with the stolen credit card is going to fly into John Wayne Airport Friday of that Memorial Day weekend. Now, the airport was under surveillance by over 20 detectives from local and federal agencies, including Detective Timothy Vu. At the airport, a woman matching the surveillance arrives. But when police see the woman, they're a little taken aback because she's traveling with 4 young children on what looks like a family vacation. Because she didn't fit the profile they were expecting, the police are hesitant to arrest her right then and there. So they decide to follow her. They started to suspect that maybe someone local had given this woman the credit card to book the flights and she didn't even know it was stolen. The police follow her and her children to a hotel in Santa Ana, and then to Orange County, where she and her children visit some people in the area. Nothing suspicious. But then this mystery woman makes a stop at the South Coast Plaza Mall, and she uses Smith's credit card and her ID, and that's when police make their move. On Memorial Day, about 5 weeks after the murder, police arrest this mystery woman at her hotel. They search her purse, in which they find $2,000 in cash, and identification and credit cards belonging to both Anita Vo and Ha Smith. So who is this woman using a murder victim's credit card and taking her children on a vacation with stolen money? The woman police arrested was 41-year-old Tanya Jamie Nelson. Nelson had grown up in the Vietnamese community of Orange County. She eventually opened up a lingerie and gift shop in Little Saigon in 1998. Financial records show that the business did not do well, and in March of 2000, Nelson and her husband at the time, Jonathan, filed for bankruptcy. Court records show that they had accumulated over $200,000 in credit card debt and personal loans. About a year before the murders, however, Nelson left her husband and took her children and her business to North Carolina. So why did a woman who lived across the country have Ha Smith and Anita Vo's credit cards and IDs? Nelson isn't saying anything to the police, so they send local officers in North Carolina to search her shop and her home. At her house, police find a planner of Nelson's, and in that planner, on the date of April 21st, the day before the victims were found dead in their home, the words "horrible sin" are written. Along with that chilling note in the planner, police find a receipt for a return flight from Orange County to North Carolina for April 22nd, the day after the murders. But what's even more interesting is that it looks like she did not fly home alone. The flight receipt says she traveled back to North Carolina with a man named Philippe Zamora. Now, Zamora was a 50-year-old machine operator and a friend of Nelson who also lived in North Carolina. Zamora was arrested at his home 2 days after Nelson on June 1st. Now, unlike Nelson, when they arrest Zamora for the murder of Ha Smith and Anita Vo, he quickly confesses. He says that yes, he was involved with the murders, but he only killed Ha Smith, not Anita Vo. He says it was Tanya Nelson who killed Anita and was the mastermind of the whole operation. In 2009, 4 years after the murder of Anita and Ha, Philippe Zamora pleads guilty to 2 felony counts of first-degree murder and burglary and was sentenced to life in prison. The death penalty was taken off the table because he was set to testify against Nelson during her trial. And boy, did he. In January of 2010, Tanya Nelson's trial began, and it was a death penalty case. The deputy district charged Nelson with several special circumstances that could have led to the death sentence, including committing multiple murders, murdering for financial gain during a commission of a burglary, during a commission of a robbery, and lying in wait. In his testimony via a Vietnamese translator, Zamora said that Nelson was a friend of his and his wife. Now, Nelson knew one of Zamora's biggest secrets. She knew that even though he was married to a woman, he was secretly gay. She told him that if he came to California with her to rob Ha Smith, she would set him up with some gay men she knew in Orange County. Zamora agreed, and he went to California with her. Now, Zamora knew who Ha Smith was because his wife was actually a client of hers, and he was aware of the money and expensive jewelry that was going to be in the home. Zamora said that he and Nelson went to Ha Smith's home under the guise of wanting to get a reading done. According to court documents, once inside, Nelson grabbed a knife from the kitchen and stabbed Anita Vo, Ha's daughter. And then she ordered Zamora to do the same to Smith. Now, Zamora said that he started to panic when he saw Nelson stab Anita, and Ha started screaming in horror. With Ha screaming, Nelson yelled, kill her, don't let her scream." And that was when he grabbed a nearby champagne bottle and hit Ha in the head with it. He then grabbed a knife from the kitchen as well and started to stab Ha. After both women lay on the floor incapacitated, bleeding to death, Zamora and Nelson ransacked the home, taking cell phones, jewelry, a laptop, credit cards, and other personal items. Zamora said that later they went to Walmart and purchased white paint, went back to the scene of the crime, and poured the paint over the victims, which he says was an attempt to cover up evidence. When the prosecution asked why he and Nelson murdered Anita and Ha instead of just robbing them, Zamora had an interesting story. He said during the murder, he was just following Nelson's orders. But then he said on the way home from California, Nelson told him that Ha had given her a fortune that did not come true, and that was why she and her daughter, who was guilty by association, needed to die. Nelson's defense tried to say that Zamora acted alone and was blaming Nelson to escape the death penalty. They also said that there was no physical evidence placing Nelson at the crime scene. But the prosecution painted a very different picture and gave a lot more insight into this mysterious fortune that didn't come true for Nelson and drove her to murder. According to court documents, when Nelson was living in Orange County, she was a longtime client of Ha Smith and even considered her a friend. In 2000, when Nelson's lingerie shop was struggling and she and her husband declared bankruptcy, Nelson had gone to Ha for advice. Ha eventually told her that she should move her business to North Carolina, where it would be more successful. And that's just what Nelson did. She left her husband in California and took her kids and her business to North Carolina. Nelson and her husband were not divorced, and he was known to visit her in North Carolina, but they were not living together. And this was convenient for Nelson because she was having a secret affair with her brother-in-law, who also happened to live in North Carolina. This move to North Carolina was supposed to be great for Nelson, according to Ha Smith. She was going to be successful in all aspects of her life in this new state. But soon it became clear that Ha's premonition was not coming true for Nelson. Like it had in California, Nelson's business was failing, and so was her relationship with her brother-in-law. You see, he had gotten a new girlfriend because, according to him, he knew the relationship with Nelson couldn't go anywhere. You know, her being married to his brother and all. Now, through all this, Nelson was still reaching out to Ha Smith for advice, but none of it was getting her relationship or her business back on track. That's when Nelson decided to stop leaving her fate up to a fortune teller and start taking things into her own hands. According to her brother-in-law, Nelson started harassing him and his new girlfriend. She even told him that she was going to kidnap his girlfriend, cut off her fingers, and mail them back to him. Nelson would even drive by this woman's house and spray paint things like "cocksucker, loverboy, run" before she sucks you dry on her home. She even broke into this woman's house and stole a picture of her brother-in-law out of a photo album. With this and her business going under for the second time, Nelson would be constantly calling Ha Smith to demand more fortunes and explain why nothing had worked out the way she had predicted. While Ha tried to explain that some things were just out of her hands and that she was sorry that she could not change reality for her, Nelson would not listen. With her life in shambles, Nelson decided that someone had to pay for her hardships, and that's when she enlisted her friend Philippe Zamora to help her steal from Smith. But when Zamora and Nelson arrived at Ha's house on April 21st, it wasn't just money she was after. It was revenge. She believed that Ha Smith had deceived her and set her up for failure, and therefore she needed to die. It took less than a day for the jury to make their decision. They had Zamora's testimony, they had the plane tickets that placed her in Orange County the day of the murder, the credit cards and IDs that were on Nelson when she was arrested, witness accounts of her past behavior against her brother-in-law and his girlfriend, and they had the note that read "horrible sin" in her planner on the day of the murder. The jury found Nelson guilty of 2 felony counts of special circumstances murder, the special circumstances being murder of multiple victims, murder by lying in wait, and murder during a commission of a robbery. Now, one thing that was never explained was why Tanya Nelson had chosen white paint to cover the bodies, and to this day, it remains her secret. Tanya Jamie Nelson was given the death penalty and is currently incarcerated at the Central California's Women's Facility, the home of California Death Row for Women. While she was sentenced to death in 2010, the last time the death penalty had been carried out in California was in 2000. And in March 2019, all executions were halted by an official moratorium ordered by Governor Gavin Newsom. Prisoner officials plan to transfer California's condemned inmates into general population over the next 2 years. The men in San Quentin would be moved to other maximum security prisons, while the female inmates who were housed at the Central California Women's Facility would just live in less restrictive units in the same prison. So it's entirely possible that Tanya Nelson will continue to live out her days in prison and never actually receive the death penalty. The most tragic part about this story is that Ha Smith was doing everything she could to keep her house secure. The house had been broken into before, and she had set up security measures to keep her and her daughter safe. And yet, she let her murderers walk through the front door because she trusted them. They were people she knew, people she had known for a long time, and they betrayed her. Ha Smith and Anita Vo will always be remembered by the community of Little Saigon and the friends and family who love them.
This episode was written by Alexa Morrissey, researched by Victoria Cox, and produced by Michael Morrissey, John Scassia, and Heidi Schweyerman. Stranger in the House is a Boy Wonder production. All our sources for this episode will be linked in the bio and on our website, strangerinthehouse.com. But a special thanks to the various reporting by the Los Angeles Times and Investigation Discovery's Wicked Attraction. You can follow us at strangerinthehouse.com, @_strangerinthehouse on Instagram and TikTok, and @_strangerpod.
So long for now, strangers, and stay safe.